So thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar today, and welcome to Governance and Stewardship for Watershed Investment Programs. I will be your host for today, as well as the moderator for this webinar, and my name is Florence Mugi, and I serve as the Network Manager with the Nature Conservancy. So before we start, I would like to give a few Zoom functions, features that we'll be using today to ensure smooth engagement. And I'll be sharing my screen. So we'll be using four main functions for this webinar. And one of the function is the chat button. I'll just give it like 2 seconds to ensure everybody is able to locate the chat function. The chat function will use it to send messages to the panelists as well as to the participants. Therefore, everything that you post on the chat will be visible to all that are joining us today. The second feature that we'll be using is the Q&A. And the Q&A button, we'll be using this for all the questions during this webinar. So therefore, to ensure that your questions get answered by the panelists, please post your questions in the Q&A function. I hope you can be able to locate that at the bottom of your screens. And just a reminder, we'll be having 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Therefore, we'll have a bit more time to answer all your questions that you have for today. The other function that we'll be using is the transcription or language captioning. And we'll use these for language captioning, and therefore please select your preferred language. I'll be showing you how to in a moment. But as long as you can locate the 2 CCs at the bottom of your screen would be great. The last function that we'll be using is the resources. These are news function that wasn't introduced a long time ago. So we'll have several links in there, and these will be links to the resources that most of the speakers will be mentioning or be alluded to. Therefore, if you can locate the resources on your screens, that will help with our engagement today. So for language captioning, so once you click the bar for the captions, you will be able to see the speaking languages, or the speakers will be speaking in English. Therefore, you can use the language for the captioning, and you can read as we go along. So as a reminder, this webinar will be delivered in English and recorded, and this recording will be available after the webinar, together with the webinar slides as well as other resources. So all participants will be muted, and we request that you send all your questions to the Q&A button, and most of the panelists will be answering the questions as we go along. So before we start, we would like to know who is in the room with us. And we have a quick poll on Mentimeter. So these can be done either using your phone or on your laptop. You can open your browser and type menti.com, either on your phone or on your laptop, and you can enter the code that is on the screen with green highlight, or you can use the QR code. You can scan it and it will take you direct to Menti. This is to be able to know who is in the room with us. So please type your country that you're calling in us from. I'll give it a minute. Use the green code, and it's menti.com. or you can use the QR code to scan. And I will display the results in a minute. Amazing. But quite a diverse audience. So I'll give it another few seconds. Thank you for participating in this poll. And so glad to see all the countries and the colors showing up, from Africa to Latin America to the United States to Europe. Amazing. Keep them coming. We have about 34 responses and we are about 75 persons. So you can scan the QR code and enter the code that is at the top of the screen. Great. Okay, so we will move ahead. So for those who joined a few minutes late, I'm your host and moderator for this webinar. And my name is Florence Mugi, and I serve as the network manager with the Nature Conservancy. So for today's agenda, we have an introduction to governance 101 that will be delivered by our own Iman Ahmed from the Nature for Water facility. That will be followed by Nabia Ofuso, who will be sharing the role of corporates in stewardship and governance of watershed investment programs. And we'll have 3 case studies that will be shared from South Africa, New Mexico, and also Norfolk in Europe. And after that, we have a Q&A for about 15 minutes and announcements at the end. So I'll drop my screen to allow the first speaker to share her screen. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Iman Ahmed, who is an engagement manager with the Nature for Water facility, and will be giving us an introduction to governance 101. Iman, feel free to share your own screen, or I can do it for you. Let me know.
Thank you, Florence. And yes, would it be possible for you to share the slides? And as a quick introduction, as Florence said, I'm Iman Ahmed. I am an engagement manager with the Nature for Water facility, which is a technical facility hosted by the Nature Conservancy and Pegasus that helps build watershed investment programs that use nature-based solutions. And we start this webinar with an introduction on what governance is. It's often a nebulous and unclear, intangible concept. And while there's no strict definition for what governance is, one can think of it as a system of rules, practices, and processes that enable transparency and accountability within an organization or a program, and one that enables effective decision-making within that program as well. Governance is also often a method to balance the various interests within an organization. And some of the key outcomes we hope to achieve through our governance is having a clear definition of the purpose, mandate, and objective of a program, enabling transparent and effective decision-making within the program to carry out its mission, ensuring clarity around the roles and responsibilities of parties involved, ensuring accountability of the parties involved, and then finally ensuring compliance with any laws and regulations in the country that the program is established. So with that, we can move to the next slide. which talks a little bit more about how governance is captured. It's difficult to see an organization's governance clearly because it's often captured through like a multitude of outputs. Again, there is no strict definition or way in which governance should be captured, but typically you see it documented and captured through 3 different methods. So the first is a governance structure which outlines the various parties, bodies, committees who would be involved in the program, their high-level roles, and how decisions and approvals flow through these parties. The second is through documented composition, powers, and responsibilities of the parties involved in delivering the program's mandate, and this includes any governing bodies or approval committees. These responsibilities are typically formalized in a charter or a policy, and a governing body's responsibilities can also be formalized in a bylaw and articles of association. So the form in which these things are formalized can be different and can be tailored to each program and each program's needs and the legal structure of each program. The third thing to look at when trying to understand an institution organization's governance is looking at policies and processes. Documenting key processes that enable transparent decision-making and approvals. So this could be captured through a process, an SOP, a policy, and an example of this could be developing a fundraising process or disbursement process to pay contractors to ensure that the approvals process for that is very clearly documented. It's important to note that a program's legal structure also helps inform its governance. So whether that program is part of an existing entity, its own separate incorporated entity, or is unincorporated. So on our next slide, we have the key questions to ask across the governance lifecycle. And so depending on your program's maturity, you're at a different stage when thinking about governance. And so this helps guide you through what your key priorities are depending on the stage of your program. So at program initiation or conceptualization, you're really thinking about why is your governance structure required, and starting to think about what legal structure you might want to introduce for your program. As you move closer towards design, you're thinking about who is governing the program. Do you need to establish a committee or a new body to govern the program? Are there existing people, structures who can govern the program? And then you're also thinking about how the program will be established from a legal perspective. You're formalizing that decision of whether you want to set up your own entity, whether this is going to be a collaborative agreement between multiple parties. And then finally, as you move towards operationalization, you're thinking more in terms of documenting the 3 mechanisms I had mentioned in the previous slide. So you're developing those documents, you're developing the processes, you're developing the systems, you're developing your charters that will kind of underpin your legal arrangement and underpin the governance of the program. On our next slide, we have the important elements you would consider when looking at governance. So there are many things to consider in a program's governance, but on a high level, you want to make sure you're looking at the organization and its structure. So how will the program be organized? What are the various functions that the program need to play? And who is playing those functions? What are their exact roles and responsibilities? How will important things, decisions, information, and funding flow through this group? The second key element is decision-making, which we've covered before. So what is the process by which decisions are made? Who is making these decisions? Who needs to make funding decisions versus implementation plan approval decisions? And are there other stakeholders who need to be consulted when those decisions are being made, even if they are not the final approvers or deciders? Third, we have implementation. So how is implementation managed? Who is doing implementation? Is it a subcontractor? Is it in-house? Who's approving implementation plans? Who's coordinating implementation? Fourth, we have monitoring and evaluation. So similar questions: who's developing your monitoring and evaluation plan? Who is collecting data? Who's consolidating, visualizing data? And who's sharing that data further with other parties who need to know this data or need to report this data? Fifth, we have funding. So is there a fundraising team? Is there an individual who conducts fundraising? Who's managing funder relationships? Who's managing funder reporting? And how is budgeting being done? Is there a finance function? Is the fundraiser also doing a bit of finance? Often these programs are smaller, and so you don't often have a single FTE or single staff member looking at each of these things. It's often a blend. A role is like a blend of multiple roles within the watershed investment programs we work with. And so it's important to be clear on who is doing each task. And so relatedly, we're also looking at reporting and operationalization. So how often are programs reporting impact? What reports are they publishing? Is it a financial report? Is it more a success impact-oriented report? And who has access to these reports? Who's receiving these reports? And then finally, on the operational side, who does the work that the program delivers? Is it in-house staff? Do we need to hire new staff? Who's managing payrolls and budgets and benefits that these staff receive? So governance really encompasses the entire organization and the entire program and the various elements in each of them. From our experience, there are 3 major watershed investment program governance models that we see. They're definitely not the only models available out there. These are the high-level structures that exist within the Water Funds Network. The first is an umbrella agreement where multiple parties come together to collaboratively deliver a mandate through an agreement or a memorandum of understanding. The second is a hosted program where an existing organization hosts a watershed investment program within its organizational structure. So an example of this would be TNC, maybe, or the Nature Conservancy hosting a program within its organizational structure. And so a lot of the organizational aspects get taken care of by TNC, such as payroll, finance. And the third model is a dedicated vehicle where a separate legal entity is established with its own staff and processes to deliver the program's mandate. Many programs wait a few years before exploring this option, and it might not be the right fit for many programs, even as they become more mature and established. So I think the key thing to remember here is that governance is really customized to your needs and is dependent on your context, on your mandate and your objectives, and need not fit a specific model.
Thank you, Iman, for the great presentation. And as a reminder, we'll have a Q&A at the end, so please post your questions in the Q&A button. We'll also be opening up resources related to each speaker's content on the resources button. I had explained a bit on where you can find these. So I'm opening a few. You might be able to see some of those resources under the resources button. You might see a pop-up on your screen. And now we'll have our second speaker, who is Nabia Ofusu, who works with the Nature Conservancy, and she will spend 30 seconds to introduce herself before her presentation. Nabia.
Great. Thank you, Florence. Hi, everybody. I'm Nabia Ofosuama, Senior Corporate Engagement Advisor focused on water and resilience here on the TNC Global team. And I will be talking today about the role of corporations in governance and how they can also steward these watershed investment programs. So at the Nature Conservancy, we believe that it's really important to involve the private sector in this work and that they have a critical role to play for a range of reasons. It's really critical for them to be involved in these watershed investment programs as essential water users in a lot of the places where we're working, and for a number of reasons that I'll cover in the presentation as well. And companies also recognize that they have a case, there is a business case for them to invest in watersheds as well. You can see here information from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN on global water withdrawals. So you'll see the big blue part of the graph is 71% of water that is withdrawn is from agriculture. And then 15% of that is withdrawn for industrial purposes and 13% for municipal purposes. So companies are significant water users, the industrial use that we see, that 15%. But then also agricultural inputs that go into a lot of the products that we consume use a lot of water as well. So if there was no water, or if water was of poor quality, this would have a significant impact from a business perspective. So we see companies very interested in addressing that water risk and interested in partnering on watershed investment programs because of that. You can see some of the risks that are leading companies to make these investments. They're seeing water costs increase. They're seeing risk of business disruption. Customer and investor expectations towards water are shifting. There's more of an expectations that companies will steward their water well. There is, limited ability to expand. So if there is an allocation for water or water-related performance that allows companies to grow and expand. And then there have also been global pushes like the Global Biodiversity Framework to protect biodiversity, and that requires healthy water ecosystems. So those are many of the things that we see companies, private sector entities thinking about and why there is a case for them to invest in watersheds. This is not necessarily new. We've seen companies investing in water stewardship for quite some time. There's a timeline here from Limnotech that showcases what has been driving some of this. There were some companies that began to set global water targets in the mid to late 2000s. Many more water stewardship tools and initiatives were developed later on in the 2000s. You're seeing the Alliance for Water Stewardship, which helps companies think about how to address their water challenges, established in 2014. And then more and more companies have begun setting water targets, setting ambitious goals. And we're seeing in the past few years, those goals shift to include things like setting targets in the local context, setting targets that are science-based, and really identifying what are the local challenges, and really trying to address the health of watersheds as well in how companies are investing. You can also see some of the companies from a global perspective who have set corporate water stewardship goals. You can see the timeline of kind of when that started on this slide. Obviously, many, many more companies in the world who have also set goals, but just a selection here of the types of global companies who've set goals, and then also some of the things that are happening in the broader landscape around the Sustainable Development Goals, different kind of US government regulations as well that are driving some of what companies have done. So in talking about why companies might be interested, we are also talking about where that company interest intersects with watershed investment programs and the role that companies can play in the stewardship of this water. So we see the intersection in the work that TNC does and the watershed investment programs in general that are focused on looking at the integrity of freshwater ecosystems at a watershed scale. And as I mentioned, corporations are requiring a consistent supply of good quality water for their operations and value chains, and they're looking to manage their water-related risks, whether those be physical risks around the amount of water or the quality of the water, regulatory, reputational, or financial risks they may be facing. And so watershed investment programs really are the intersection of, the types of work that different entities like TNC want to do through the watershed investment programs, what companies are interested in doing to ensure water security. And you can see a number of the corporations that have engaged with TNC in watershed investment programs over the past 25 years on the slide. So in terms of the roles that we're seeing companies play, we see a range of different things depending on the context of the initiative. So Iman was mentioning the different types of governance options and how there are different individuals who are participating in that. We have seen companies interested in kind of being engaged in that as well. One thing that we're seeing companies do is recruiting their peers. So sometimes, companies have really been interested in water security in a specific geography that's very important to them. And so they want to bring other companies that are also using the water or other suppliers or partners of them to be part of the program. So they can, once they get into the program, they can also bring others along. We've also seen company representatives on the boards of water funds. And in the case studies that are following, you'll hear some examples of that. There was a company that sat on the board in the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. So they're lending their time and their knowledge that they have of the watershed to sit on the board and help direct what the Watershed Investment Program is doing. We've also seen water companies and other companies that have done a lot of research on the watershed contribute hydrologic expertise as well. So they may have a lot of knowledge about the water flows based on their general practice of doing business, and they can share that with the Watershed Investment Program to contribute to the ongoing management and development of it as well. Next, we also see companies leveraging government contacts. Sometimes there is a need for the watershed investment programs to engage with different parts of the local or national government where this work is taking place. And companies may be able to make those introductions or have connections that the Watershed Investment Program may not have. And also having their voice to advocate for the importance of watershed protection can also help to bring additional government contacts and entities on board. We've also seen companies provide kind of in-kind assistance. So they may be providing equipment or agricultural inputs. For example, there might be seeds that are needed for the planting activities that are being done. And so companies can engage from kind of an in-kind perspective related directly to the nature of their business. And then lastly, we also see companies providing financial support. I think that's sometimes where watershed investment programs start or where they think about, what's most likely from a corporation. But we want to make sure that people know that there are many roles that companies can play in addition to financial support. And we've seen that be quite significant for our program. So over $70 million has been provided from over 100 companies to TNC Watershed Investment Programs since they began in 2000. So a significant opportunity for funding to move these forward as well, in addition to all of the other things that companies can do as good water stewards that has benefits for the watersheds, the communities, and the people that are living in those places as well. So with that, I will hand it back to Florence and look forward to answering any questions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Nabia, for the great presentation. If you have questions for Nabia, please type them on the chat. Or you on the Q&A, sorry. Type them on the Q&A button, and we'll keep answering the questions as they come. And as a reminder, we have a Q&A session at the end where we'll be able to answer more questions. So I'm enabling a few more resources. on corporate engagement. You'll see them pop up on your screens. And you can be able to view them after the webinar. I'll see the links. So our next speaker is Kirsten Watson, who is the Greater Cape Town manager, and will be sharing a case study of the Greater Cape Town waterfront and how governance and water stewardship is showing up in that waterfront. Kirsten.
Thank you, Florence. So I'm with the Nature Conservancy, manager for the Greater Cape Town Water Fund based in Cape Town. And my name's Kirsten Watson, and I'm so privileged to share the story about water stewardship, specifically governance in watershed investment and the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. So the Greater Cape Town Water Fund started with collective action. It is a multi-stakeholder public-private partnership. And the reason so many of these from national, private, corporates, and research institutions got together is because of the looming crisis, which was the 2018 drought, where the city of Cape Town nearly ran out of water. This was also called Day Zero, meaning the number of days until there was no more water in the taps. In response to this drought event, to prevent future scenarios where the city was in a crisis, the new water strategy was launched, and this had various other augmentation schemes to try and manage water efficiently. One of these was a nature-based solution, and that was looking at the watersheds themselves. What was the condition of the watersheds? At the time, 2/3 of the watersheds were invaded with alien invasive plants. These are quite woody, high biomass plants. They use significantly more water than the natural vegetation called fynbos. Initial estimates show that they use 24% more water than the native vegetation, which is critical in periods of drought to have that water flowing into the streams to fill the dams. To try and unpack this further, the Greater Cape Town Water Fund was established and a business case was developed. This business case was critical to prioritize where investments need to be in a coordinated manner and to gain the necessary financing over a 30-year period to try and resolve the problem. The graph on the slide shows over 30 years what finance is needed, with a high impact phase with the blue bars showing initial investment, which is quite intensive, and then a lower impact phase where you do follow-up clearing, which is going back to the same sites to remove new alien plants that grow from the seeds following the initial clearing. This is essentially the structure of a water fund. So a water fund basically means that those who are impacted by water insecurity or benefit by water security contribute towards the management of the watershed where water comes from. And the water fund provides the means to facilitate that process, either through payments, technical assistance, tools, or governance. And those benefits would then flow downstream. On the Greater Cape Water Fund, so this is slightly different to the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, which came out of the business case. This is the more formalized maturity phase of the Greater Cape Water Fund. This governance structure is separate from the Nature Conservancy, who's initiated and led the implementation of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. It was established in June 2023 as a not-for-profit company. It has appointed board members. One is a corporate partner, also consultants, the Nature Conservancy, and we bring in other expertise, such as legal expertise, that volunteer their time on the board. This board meets quarterly to look at the governance structure of the new entity and how it can set itself up as a special vehicle to facilitate the financing long-term for the Water Fund. The Nature Conservancy is still leading the Greater Cape Town Water Fund until such time that the Greater Cape Water Fund is sustainable to go on its own. And there are 3 key governance structures that support the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. The first is the Data and Operations Working Group. The second is the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group. And the third is the Sustainable Funding Working Group. I'll touch on each of these. The Operations and Data Working Group was initiated right at the start of the Water Fund. And that's because there are many implementing partners in the catchments. And we need to have coordinated effort as to how we invest our time to clear the alien invasive plants and a coordinated catchment approach. And the main functioning of this working group is to look at tracking of investments, coordinating planning, prioritizing how and where we work, and validating that the work is done to a certain standard. In this working group, we have a rotating chairperson. So every year, a new entity leads the working group. We meet monthly, and we have individuals representing national, provincial, local government institutions, as well as NGOs and landowners and water boards. So it really is an integrated working group across the different structures to make sure work is done coherently on the land. The second one is the monitoring and evaluation. At the start of the Water Fund, with the development of the business case, we brought in the best science and expertise to bring in the baseline data to help track our impact over time. This is essential to show progress for management effectiveness, to also track partnership satisfaction, and the impact it has on the individuals working and doing the hard work in the catchments. The last working group is funding. So this doesn't work unless the funding is secured. And you need all of the previous governance structures to make the funding work. So this is the funding sources secured to date for the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. You can see a blend of a large local investment support from the city of Cape Town, just $7,000, corporate investment and philanthropy and foundations. Moving forward, we have this blended funding model, and for the high impact phase, the first 6 years of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, we've been quite successful in leveraging private sector support through corporate funding, philanthropy, and also local municipal investment, because these individuals were with us from the beginning. They have a vested interest and they want to continue seeing sustainable watershed management. But moving forward, we need to look at longer sustainability financing mechanisms. And the Nature Conservancy is exploring with the Nature for Water facility various options. The one is looking at a water bond, which is an outcomes-based funding instrument. And this we're exploring with Rand Merchant Bank. And this has the potential to scale to many other similar projects within South Africa. It's quite a more advanced financial instrument, and the governance structures are essential to make this feasible. The second one is looking at water resource management charges. This is where government, specifically from national government and also local provincial government, can potentially provide long-term financing of sustained catchment management. And lastly, an endowment. So because it's a separate entity, the fundraising of the overheads and the hidden costs is often very difficult, and an endowment is going to be essential to ensure that this entity can sustain itself for the long term. And all of these funding mechanisms require very stringent governance structures and decision-making structures for them to work properly. And we need to have good integration between the data and operations on the ground, the monitoring and the data recording, and this execution of the financing. And lastly, it's scaling impact. So we're focusing on the 7 priority catchments, but moving to 2030, we'll be looking at all the catchments that provide water to the city of Cape Town and surrounding areas. So just in a nutshell, just to summarize our journey and how governance has changed through the duration of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. In the beginning, we had our feasibility phase. We had lots of stakeholder engagement, outreach, getting key partners on board like the City of Cape Town, making the business case, setting up our steering committees and working groups. We then moved into implementation and all the governance structure needed to actually implement effectively. And in 2023, we moved into our maturity phase, looking at the independent entity, setting up the board and scaling for impact. And lastly, we're replicating this through partners elsewhere in South Africa. So the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Reserve is leading the Greater Kruger Water Fund, and Wild Trust is leading the Utikela Water Fund. And they are both in the feasibility phase, moving into the implementation phase. And this just shows that if you can get the structures right, they can be replicable in other areas. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. That was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing the lessons and experiences while establishing the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. So our next speaker will be sharing a case study from the New Mexico Rio Grande Water Fund is Jason. And Jason is the New Mexico Forest Strategy Director with the Nature Conservancy. Welcome, Jason.
Greetings, everyone. Coming to you from New Mexico, also known as the Land of Enchantment. And I can confirm it is indeed an enchanting place. When most people think of New Mexico, they think of deserts and arid landscapes. But in fact, being the 5th largest state in the United States, we have tens of millions of acres of forests. These forests, as it is a dry landscape, are fire adapted. In other words, fire is a keystone process here in New Mexico that essentially shapes the structure, function, and biodiversity of our forests. Historically, wildfire has influenced these processes in a way that has been productive and healthy. Unfortunately, over the last few generations, there has been a policy in the United States and the Western United States of excluding fire, and the intention was to protect communities, to reduce the risk to forest resources and to wildlife. Unfortunately, we've come to learn that by excluding fire, we've actually made our communities and our forests more at risk. So the Rio Grande Water Fund is focused on restoring the health and well-being to our forests, and in turn protecting our water supplies, because most of our water comes from our mountains where we find our forests. In this context, today I want to share with you a little bit more about the background of the Rio Grande Water Fund, what its inception story. I want to talk a little bit about its structure, how it's organized, and then we've been around for just over a decade. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some lessons learned and some next steps for the organization. All right, so in terms of context, talking about our theory of change, I gave you a little bit of background already about the forests in New Mexico and just how vast they are and how important they are to water security. So when we think about theories of change, to put it simply, we often think like a hypothesis. If we do some activity, then we expect a specific outcome. At the Rio Grande Water Fund, our hypothesis is that if we secure financing from water users, from other entities that are interested in forest health and water security, then we can channel those funds to land managers who are working in the forest to make them healthier and more secure, to avoid catastrophic wildfire and to bring back fire that is healthy and natural for the forests. Ultimately, when we think about theories of change, we also want to test our assumptions. And in our case, our assumption is that by undertaking forest treatments, which include thinning of the forest to reduce the density, but also bringing back good fire. So we bring back low intensity fire that's natural to this landscape to remove intense amounts of biomass and to restore the natural role of fire in this landscape. So that's really our theory of change, is investing money in order to reduce the risk of wildfire. And in doing so, we're protecting water supplies and ensuring our forests are as healthy as they can be. Here is a map showing you the Rio Grande waterfront landscape. So today I'm speaking to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, which you can see here on the map. This is a landscape. It's the upper watershed of the Rio Grande River that's in New Mexico. And essentially it's over 5 million acres. There's about 2 million acres of dry forests that need our attention and support in order to protect them in the long term. A couple other things to note, just that this map is about wildfire risk reduction. So the areas in darkest green are showing, based on our modeling, where our forest treatments have had an impact that has reduced the risk of catastrophic wildfire. Again, fire is a natural process on the landscape, but in recent decades, fires have become bigger and hotter, more intense, and our goal is to reduce that intensity, that size, that frequency, and bring it back to its normal cadence of low-intensity wildfire. Down in the bottom, you can see a map. If you're not familiar, here's New Mexico in the United States, and our Rio Grande waterfront is in the northern part of New Mexico, which is the main source of water supplies. One other thing I want to point out is in the far upper northern portion of the Rio Grande waterfront footprint, our area of focus is the San Juan Chama project area. And this is a relatively small landscape with about 15,000 acres of treatable forest area. But this forest is incredibly important to water supplies in New Mexico. Essentially, about 50% of Santa Fe's water supply comes from this area, and about 90% of Albuquerque, our biggest city in New Mexico, gets its water from this area. And essentially, this is a trans-boundary project that moves water from the San Juan Mountains and the San Juan River Basin into the Colorado River Basin. And this water is critical for farmers and communities, and it's also at high risk of wildfire. So TNC New Mexico is working in this landscape as well as the Rio Grande waterfront footprint within New Mexico. Okay, so before I turn to talking about the structure, I just want to highlight a few of our achievements over the years. The Rio Grande Waterfront was initiated by a wide swath of society in New Mexico, everyone from forest industry representatives to government agencies to nonprofits and foundations and others. And that's really illustrated in the breadth of the work that we do. So I told you that we're focused on reducing catastrophic wildfire, improving water security, but in doing so, we're also generating economic opportunities within what is a rural landscape of northern New Mexico. So you can see here on this slide, we've supported more than 1,500 jobs through more than 50 projects with more than 25 implementing partners. This has added up to more than 250,000 acres of forest restoration activities. TNC New Mexico and our partners have raised about $5 million directly for restoration in US dollars. And we've increased that by a magnitude in terms of public funding at over $50 million. So the fund has been very successful at fundraising and getting good work done on the ground. And now that we're in our second decade, we've really been thinking a lot about what's next. How can we improve? What should we be doing and how should we be doing it? So I now want to talk with you about the evolution of the Rio Grande Water Fund and just how it's changed since its first decade and really from its startup phase to today. Funny enough, some things never change. And foremost is you can see on this screen is our annual report. And principally, our mission remains the same, and that's to protect water security for lowland communities, for farmers, for other businesses that need that water they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. Funny enough, as I was putting this presentation together, though, I noticed that the picture on this first annual report is, in fact, the same picture that I prepared in this presentation. So again, some things never change, other things do. So kind of a funny little tidbit. So moving forward more seriously around funding, So in our startup phase, we were very much focused on standing up the program and doing so in as a collaborative way as possible, really bringing together a lot of different entities. And our funding sources at that time reflected that. We had funding from the U.S. Forest Service, we had a fair bit of foundation funding, and then a lot of small private donations through our business unit here at TNC New Mexico. Over the last decade, the amount of funding has increased. Also, the sources of funding have evolved, where historically we had more funding from foundations. Today we have a lot more funding from public sources like the federal government and other public entities. We also have contracts with water utilities, and their ratepayers essentially fund some of the work that we do on the landscape, in addition to those sources that we started with, and that's private donations, foundations, and corporate funding as well. So quite the evolution in funding, but in particular, growing revenues and diversifying where the funding's coming from. Next up is governance. So when the fund was first initiated, it was conceptualized as more of a pure payments for ecosystem service program, where the idea is that downstream, in this case, users of ecosystem services, in this case hydrologic services, would pay for the protection of those resources upstream. So the idea was that investors, utilities, and others who need this water would pay the fund to do the work on the ground. And the reality is that that has happened, but not at the level that we need to get to the broader landscape. Essentially, the landscape is much bigger than the funding we have available. And so the fund was initially conceptualized as this payment for ecosystem service program, and we have a strong element of that, but we also have a strong element of other funders who are not directly using the ecosystem services also paying into the fund because it's in their mission, like the U.S. Forest Service and other entities. So I say that because the governance of the fund started with the idea that we would have a large pot of money that then could be distributed to projects all across the landscape. And that's just what we did. And really driving that, helping to influence where those projects were occurring was the governance structure, which is the executive committee, as well as signatories to our charter, which is a collaborative charter. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but more than 100 signatories have signed on. The signatories in the executive committee had a larger degree of influence on where projects happened in the initial stages than today. And part of that is due to the shift in funding, that we have more dollars from the federal government in particular in recent years. And those funders, including the federal government, really dictate to a large degree where the action can happen on the ground. And certainly we're finding funding that aligns with our mission. So it's not outside of the mission of the fund, but certainly an evolution of the fund, in that where the funds are coming from has changed the governance, and that now the executive committee and the signatories have shifted to more of an advisory role rather than a managerial role. And the business unit, which manages the fund, manages the day-to-day operations more so than in the past. Finally, just to highlight, and going back to that map I shared with you earlier, is that the geography of the fund is more than 5 million acres. This is a massive landscape. And as mentioned, really the scale of the resources that we've been able to generate are not quite sufficient to do the treatments that are needed across the entire landscape. So we've decided that what's in the best interest of the fund to maximize our mission is really to focus on those highest return on investment landscapes. And one of those in particular where we're focused now is that San Juan Chama project source area. You'll remember where I shared where Albuquerque gets most of its water, Santa Fe gets a lot of its water. And we have, instead of a 5 million plus acre landscape, we're dealing with more about 15,000 acres of forest treatment over the next 5+ years. All right, next up, I want to give a plug here to Nature for Water facility. So in thinking about the evolution of our fund, we've been working with Nature for Water to really reflect on what we've accomplished over the last 10 years, what was our structure to accomplish those outcomes, and looking to the next decade, what should our structure be and what should our goals be? And Nature for Water has really helped us think through who we are as a fund and what we do on the landscape. And that's represented by these 5 strategic pillars. Essentially, these pillars represent what we do day in and day out. And they're not new to us, but they are organized synthetically to help us think thoughtfully about where we're going and why we're doing what we're doing. And you can see here the pillars include coordinating collective action. This is bringing together different partners to really make work happen on the ground or make work happen in the policy space. Next is implement. I've been talking a lot about doing forest treatments on the ground, prescribed fire. That's certainly one of the core pillars of our program. Next up, we have influence. Influence is focused on really influencing governance in the broader landscape. So to expand prescribed fire on the landscape and to do it well, we need to improve our regulatory regime in the state. So we're looking carefully at what are the opportunities to improve policy to support the mission of the Rio Grande Water Fund. That's part of the influence pillar. Next up is strategic analysis. So we have a pretty strong team focused on helping us understand what are the risks of catastrophic wildfire on the landscape to water supplies, where should we be focusing our projects to maximize the highest return on investment. And we're not just doing that for our own internal operations, that's something we share with our partners as well. Finally, to make this all happen, we need funding, and a core pillar, of course, is inspiring investment, expanding investment, and thinking really deeply about how we can generate sustainable revenue for the long term. And so certainly there's a lot going on in this fund, but you can see how it's all organized here with these pillars. Okay, so now I want to talk briefly about governance. In just a moment, I'm going to talk with you about the core actors involved in the fund and their respective roles. But first, I just want to highlight that the governance is determined by a collaborative charter that more than 100 entities have signed on to. We call this charter the Collaborative Forest and Fire Charter for the Rio Grande Water Fund. The signatories essentially have signed on to the mission of the fund. This charter defines what happens and what doesn't happen within the fund. In other words, what do we do and what do we don't do? And this is known as an umbrella agreement, going back to earlier in our talk. So essentially, we have this agreement that we've all bought into that is a broad-based document. And then within that, to operate day-to-day, we have our bylaws. And our bylaws determine roles and responsibilities of the respective actors. Okay, so central to all of this is TNC New Mexico. So TNC New Mexico is really the nerve center of the Rio Grande Water Fund. We're the host of the fund. We raise the funds. We provide oversight of the funding, and we also provide oversight and direction for the projects that happen on the ground. Another key actor or set of actors are our signatories. As I said, our signatories have signed on to the charter. They are our core allies. They are representative of a broad swath of New Mexican society. We have healthcare providers. We have public agencies, we have businesses, we have academics, we have essentially all folks who care about water security and forest health, which is the vast majority of New Mexico organizations, have signed on in some respect to this Rio Grande Water Fund and its mission. Next up is our executive committee. I mentioned earlier that our executive committee initially was conceptualized as kind of the guiding light for the organization about which projects should happen, where, and in what form. And today, the executive committee is still a key guiding light of the Rio Grande Water Fund, but their role has shifted from less of a managerial to more of an advisory. And that's just happened naturally over time, and in recent years, we've moved to formalize that. And these individuals who represent distinct entities also offer our fund really important perspectives now to help us make sure that we're moving in the right direction, that we're representing all interests as we're moving forward. Next up is our funders. So we can't do the work without our funders. We have a broad swath of different funders, from federal agencies to state agencies to municipalities to foundations to private donors, et cetera. So a broad swath of different funders. It's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, again, where we get our funding does determine what we can do. And so they do have some degree of influence on the fund within the mission of the fund and that broader landscape that I spoke with you about. And then finally, we have our implementers. Our implementers, they come in many different forms, but most of them are contractors who work in the northern landscape of New Mexico. They're forest industry folks, so they work with timber companies to remove that extra timber on the landscape. Also, we have different partners that are nonprofits that we work with to implement prescribed fire on the landscape. So really our implementers are the the closest to the ground, making the work happen. And of course, in turn, they also influence the type of work that gets done. Exactly where projects happen is determined at a very high level, but also at a local level through our implementers. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to highlight for you, and I'll move through it quickly here, is some challenges. This could be challenges and lessons learned, but here at the fund, we're looking at challenges and next steps. So the first is that our landscape is vast, and relative to our resources, we don't have enough funding to cover the entire landscape. So as I mentioned earlier, our solution and next steps is really to move from a 5 million plus landscape that we're working on to, in this moment, we are focused on 15,000 acres of high priority landscape. And we're working with our partners in the broader landscape to implement another 15,000 acres of treatments annually. Okay, so next up is, so fire is key in this landscape. Fire has a critical role to play in ecosystem health. It's not something that will go away. It's something that will always be in the background, and we can have fires of choice or fires of chance. And the fires of chance typically are those big hot fires that I spoke about earlier. We'd prefer to have fires of choice. So to get to that place, having had some very large wildfires that have really brought great concern, and understandably to our local communities, bringing fire back to the landscape is going to require, at scale, is going to require more education and more policy change. And that's part of where the fund is going in its next decade, is really to support that education, to support that policy change, to expand our influence and to expand our work on the ground. Next up, and finally, and this is a perennial issue for any institution, is over time you have staff turnover, people find new opportunities and move on. Our fund in the last few years, we've had a few key staff move on to new roles, and in part we've lost some knowledge that we know about, and we've lost some knowledge that we don't know about. And so we're really wanting to think more about how do we retain that knowledge, and that's maybe through web tools, program manuals, codified, more consistent processes that can be understood quickly by new staff coming in, so that the next generation of staff knows why decisions were made, understands where things are located, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that was a helpful overview of the Rio Grande Water Fund. Of course, I've been happy to answer questions. It's been great to speak with you today. On this slide, you can see my email address, as well as a few other core members of the Rio Grande Water Fund. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll pass it back to Florence.
Thank you, Jason. So as a reminder, we are requesting for questions to be posted on the Q&A, so please keep them coming. We'll have 15 minutes at the end to answer the questions that you have asked. So we are going to the last speaker for today, who will be sharing the Norfolk Waterford case study, and his name is Rob Cunningham. He is the Europe Resilient Watersheds Program Director. Rob?
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen. It's going to appear. There we go.
It's coming up.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so my name's Rob Cunningham. I'm the Resilient Watersheds Program Director of Europe. And I want to talk to you about our experience in Norfolk. And listening to Jason earlier, I think there's some common lessons, but we're a bit earlier in the journey in terms of sorting our governance. So just a quick to tell you give you some idea where Norfolk is. Norfolk is in the east of England, that little red box on the map of England. It's a dry county, about 600 millimeters of rain a year. It has some really rich wildlife features, particularly chalk rivers and lowland wetlands. It's very agricultural, has some of the best agricultural land in the UK. It also has a very fast growing population, partly because it has a nice climate, lovely landscape, lots of wildlife. People want to live here. But it's also, because it's in the southeast of England, its geography makes it very vulnerable to climate change. So we've got these kind of very rich wildlife, lots of pressures. And that's really where the idea of a water fund, water investment program really came from. So these precious landscapes, they are protected under UK and international law, but they're under threat from pollution and water use. the kind of legal restrictions that are in place to protect those areas is actually acting now as a stop on development. So there's lots of restrictions on house building and economic development, and that's seen as a major issue for the local economy and for the people who live in Norfolk. There's some really interesting policies to address that have come out of the UK government. So we've got new policies around nature markets. So we've got a new national offsetting scheme for biodiversity, and also an offsetting program around nutrient neutrality. And these are been established essentially as private markets and something that could drive revenues for nature-based solutions. And then really critically, there is no conventional solution to this problem. It doesn't actually matter. We could pump all of the sewage, instead of pumping into the rivers, we could pump it all to the coast. These sites would still fail their water quality targets and their water resource targets because of the way we're managing the land. So actually nature-based solutions, it's not just an if or a maybe, it's absolutely core to protecting these sites and unlocking economic development in Norfolk. And in terms of why partner-led, well, we have a really rich kind of and receptive stakeholder group. So the local government, the Norfolk County Council, sees water as an existential threat to the future of economic development in Norfolk, and also has a very pro nature-based solutions view of the world. We have a local water utility, or regional, I should say, water utility. It's bigger than Norfolk, called Anglian Water. They are, from the chief executive down, very committed to becoming a nature-based solutions first utility. They're really keen to explore the role that nature-based solutions can play in securing water supplies and water quality across their region. And we have lots and lots of active NGOs as a perhaps unsurprisingly, it's a fairly wealthy region. It has lots of great wildlife. We have really active NGO community, many of whom are interested in nature-based solutions. So we're not short of kind of capacity for partnerships. And then thinking about the structure of that partnership, some of the key considerations, money is always number one. And again, Jason kind of mentioned this kind of concept around aggregating funding. That was definitely behind some of the early thinking of the Norfolk Water Fund. So, is this partnership going to hold funding? Holding funding might sound great, but it also brings financial risk, both for the person, for the organization holding that money if something goes wrong, but also for those who are contributing money. So how are we going to manage that risk, and how do we make the rules and manage the rules around that spending? Staffing is another key one. So, is this project going to have staff? And how do we manage that stuff with, lots of health and safety, governance issues, management issues? How do we do something that, how do we manage staff in a way that respects all the laws and policies that we need to be respecting? Project management, are we going to be delivering these projects? Are we going to be dispersing funds for others to deliver? And how would we manage that funding, and how would we manage the risk from that dispersing that funding? And then transparency and engagement. So reputational risks. So we all think nature-based solutions are brilliant, but we're doing things in the landscape. We're doing things in landscapes that people love. We're working with water companies in the UK that's private, or in England anyway, private utilities. They have their own kind of public perception. So how do we manage those risks, and how do we engage with stakeholders? And one of the things that everyone talks about in England is special purpose vehicles. So there's a lot of interest in this in the NGO world about setting up legal entities that manage large programs or projects, and having these, and that's not a small undertaking. So the question we've been asking ourselves repeatedly is, do we need a special purpose vehicle? And I'll just quickly run through the evolution in Norfolk to kind of illustrate how some of those things play out. And I think it's really important to reflect that everything starts with a conversation, and everything actually starts with ad hoc governance. A group of people, a group of organizations get together, they share an idea, they share a vision, and from those discussions, from those meetings, from those mutual agreements, we move into a formal partnership. And that's definitely how Norfolk started, And the end point of that really was agreeing a memorandum of understanding. But that didn't really bring any legal weight or financial weight, but it was us saying, yes, we want to work together, and yes, we commit in a relationship of high levels of trust. We commit to work together to develop this concept. Very rapidly, the project moved into this kind of developing phase, and again, Nature for Water was mentioned earlier. We really relied heavily on Nature for Water to help us in this developing phase, but actually the project also employed a project officer. We started commissioning studies, and there was some pooling of funds to support staff. We did some engagement with stakeholders around the concepts and the products that we were producing, and ultimately the publication of a business plan, which again was tested with stakeholders. And the governance structure we landed on for this was a hosted program, hosted by Water Resources East, which is one of the founding partners. We have a core partner decision-making group, which is essentially the funders. So that's TNC, Water Resources East, Anglian Water, and Norfolk County Council. And we have kind of relatively ad hoc consultation with stakeholders around key decisions. And just to reflect on why we went for a hosted program rather than straight to a special purpose vehicle or a separate legal entity, actually we were just really lucky. Going back to capacity, so Water Resources East already exists in the region as a non-profit. It already has a strategic role in water resource planning, so not nature-based solutions, but it works, extensively on water issues across the region and in Norfolk. Its senior management and its kind of core purpose really maps its senior management has a strong interest in natural capital, and that really maps across its purpose. It has brilliant, robust governance. So it's already managing funding from a range of sources to deliver water resource projects. It's got the governance to manage that risk. So we've got really good confidence that that we can host a program there, and that the money will be spent wisely, and there'll be the right controls in place. And importantly, it's got the capacity to absorb that scale of funding. A few $100,000 or £1 million maybe in total. So we could have hosted this in the water utility, but the water utility has a turnover of probably £750 million a year. There would be no senior management oversight. This project would be seen as too small. But in Water Resources East, it's a bit like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. It's just the right size organization to host it. And for Water Resources East, like I said, there's a really great strategic fit with the purpose of Water Resources East, but also low levels of financial risks. They really didn't want to take on a multi-million pound program, because the total turnover of Water Resources East is in the order of £2 or £3 million a year. So they didn't want it to become essentially disproportionately large, but in this development phase, it worked perfectly. We've kind of gone through the developing phase, and we've published our business plan, and I'd encourage people to Google that, and maybe someone can put the link in chat. I would have, if I should have thought about that. But and then now we're moving into the testing phase, and what that testing phase is about is actually demonstrating the viability of the business plan. So it looks good on paper, but there's a lot of uncertainty around the nature-based solutions that we're proposing. And so we're looking to piloting. So essentially there's a growth in the number of staff. So we've got people who are out there engaging with landowners. We've got much higher cash flow because we've got grants coming in and going out to deliver nature-based solutions on the ground. Very much relying on philanthropy at this moment, because those revenues, those nature markets, have yet to mature to a point where we can use them or rely on them. And in terms of governance, at the moment, we're still within the kind of comfortable space in which Water Resources East can operate. So we're still running it as a hosted program, but we've kind of bolstered the governance. So now we have an advisory group where we have regular key stakeholder engagement. So every 4 weeks, we have the advisory group, and that it's not a decision-making body, but it provides advice and strategic steer to the original core partners who remain the main funders of the project. And also critically, Nature for Water, through the Go Fund, which is their kind of operationalization bridging funding, they've been helping us with developing new tools and processes. So we've got really clear accountability and around decision making. So we're making decisions based against our strategic criteria. We can demonstrate that, and we give the partners and our funders confidence that that we're making the best decisions. This is just a little illustration of what that looks like. It's really not very complicated. We've got the core partners, the advisory group, and the program staff. And within the program, we've got some working groups around tools, communications, and monitoring. And we're really relying on Nature for Water to support us in that. So big thanks to them. I'd love to be able to tell you what we're going to look like when we go to operational. Our business plan envisages a £30 million investment program. So that is going to be, 20 times what we've turned over already. It wouldn't be a scale at which Water Resources East would be comfortable hosting. But we are operating in a kind of zone of huge legal and policy uncertainty. What we know is the fundamental case for NBS remains sound. We know that to tackle the issues, we need nature-based solutions. But the nature markets and the policy background that underpins them has been in a state of continual flux for the last 2 years, partly because of political changes. We've had, I think, 4 prime ministers, maybe 5 in the last 4 years, 5 years of the programme. And most recently, so what essentially that means, and plus the regulated utility, the Anglian Water, has been waiting to see whether or not it actually gets its business plan confirmed, which includes about £11 million of grant money for nature-based solutions pilots. So what I can say is the utilities had that business plan approved. At the same time, we've had an announcement that says Norfolk County Council might, the regional government may be completely restructured and may actually cease to exist in 12 months. So we're waiting to see what that means in terms of governance. These kind of questions raise questions about, well, actually, does the regulated utility, can they blend finance? Can they pool it? We're still waiting to understand what that looks like and how they maintain accountability to their regulator and to their customers. Similarly, Norfolk County Council and whatever body comes after that, lots of governance internal within their organisations, which make blending really difficult. So that's a question. Actually, will that ever happen? It's not clear that legal structures allow that to happen. But really, most fundamentally, in the last 3 weeks, government has made a major announcement that it wants to essentially nationalise the provision of nutrient neutrality or nutrient credits and biodiversity credits, and that has thrown a kind of major question marks then about, like, okay, so what is the state going to deliver? What is the water fund? What can the water fund deliver? And how do those two things coexist? Now, I haven't got time to go into all the details, but what I would say is that the state is operating at a very big scale, and I think at the regional and local scale, in terms of actually understanding what needs to be done, where it's best targeted, what delivers the best outcomes for nature, their program will not be able to do that. So there is still a need for kind of that strategic coordination at a local scale, but it does the run of where the revenue comes from. And again, it's interesting hearing Jason's kind of mentioning how they started with this big blended finance model, and actually where they've landed is a much more mixed economy of funding streams. So we're still waiting to work through the detail of that. I won't touch on that. I think my take-home message in all of this is really, actually, I have spent a huge amount of time thinking about the end game and the end governance, and weeks and weeks and weeks of developing, like lovely slide decks, how we're going to pool resources and where the money is going to come from, and where the revenue is going to go, and how that all works. And actually, a lot of that is wasted effort, because I had no idea that a year later the policy framework would have shifted so fundamentally. And actually, my main reflection on our work in Norfolk is really, don't overthink the governance. Think about what you're trying to deliver, what the function is, what's your unique selling point, and actually let your form of governance be informed by the function, and that function will change over time. So be ready to be flexible, but don't spend lots and lots of time working on the end game when you've probably got several stages of evolution to go through before you understand what that end game is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob, for sharing. This brings us to the Q&A section. So we'll have all the speakers answer the unanswered questions on the Q&A button. So if you're able to see the Q&A button, you can see the answered questions and the ones that the speakers are yet to respond to. So I request all my speakers to come from backstage. And Rob, I think we can start with a question that came in for you. And this is from Robbie Tompkins. Firstly, he says it's an impressive level of engagement. What is the form of stakeholder engagement and how do you disseminate information about such regular engagements?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, so our regular engagement, it's like concentric circles. So at the center are the core partners. So these are the people who are putting money in and are kind of committed to making it happen. Then there's an inner circle of stakeholders who are the ones we talk to every month. Those are essentially NGOs and other entities. There are some commercial entities who are trying to do kind of aggregate demand and supply for nature-based solutions and for regenerative agriculture. So these are people who want to engage with the program because they want to make it work, and they also see kind of opportunities to act as suppliers or demand aggregators for us. And then so they've got a vested interest in engaging with us, trying to make things happen. And then the outer circle is everybody else, and that engagement happens every 6 months to a year. And but we also do, because we have additional staff doing land manager outreach, we're also going to kind of agricultural shows and agricultural events to kind of on more of a one-to-one basis to be able to engage with people who may not have heard of us and might not know what we're up to.
Amazing. Thank you, Rob. You can keep the questions coming in the Q&A section. We have a question that I would open to any of the speakers who want to respond to it. What kind of policies enable watershed investment programs? I don't know whether Nabia would like to give it a first go.
Well, I think I'll just say that TNC is conducting research on this year. So we will have a report coming out on different enabling conditions for nature-based solutions from a range of contexts. I think it's one of those answers about kind of it depends on, what's happening in the country, what's happening in a certain specific location. But some of the things that we're looking at as TNC are policies and regulations that allow for utilities and those managing water resources to invest in nature. Sometimes we see barriers to those sorts of institutions being able to use their funding for nature. There may be issues with investing outside of their jurisdictions if the broader watershed is kind of further away from the municipality, for example. So finding those policies and regulations that allow for that sort of investment is what we've been looking into through this study that will be released later on this year.
Thank you, Nabia. You can all be on the lookout for my email. We'll definitely share this report with the newsletter that we release quarterly. So the next question to Casting is what will it take to transition from a hosted program to a dedicated vehicle, especially if the hosted program is government-led? I know Cape Town is not government-led, but do you have some insight, Casting?
Yeah, so the host or the lead of the water fund is very important. It's quite a significant investment to initiate these water funds. and you need the dedicated staff resources and capacity. And the governance structures is just one part of it.
Thank you, Kirsten. Another question to Jason, on the in public funding sources, how does the funds hit the ground? Is it in kind by public entities or actual donors to the water fund to sort of like implement or manage? And an addition to that is what is informing the shift of funding sources? And what do you see as the future configuration of sustainable financing for the water fund? That is in maybe 2020, 2010 or 30 years to come. This was from Anthony.
Yeah, happy to answer those questions. The first is, so the funding is coming directly into the Rio Grande Water Fund, so into the TNC business unit. We're receiving the funds, we're overseeing the funds in terms of contracting. The funds are then flowing to partners who are working on the ground. Most of these are in the forest industry, so these are contractors who run timber thinning or logging operations. And then also we provide funding to our partners, as well as we use some of the funding internally to work on prescribed fire. So going back to what I said earlier, trying to achieve those fires of choice rather than fires of chance, to reduce the high severity wildfires to low severity, to move them to low severity. So we channel funds to make that happen. And the question about the evolution of funds, what is the root of that? A big part of it has been the lack of investors in our region interested in funding. We essentially provide an insurance policy against catastrophic wildfire and improving the resilience of water supplies. And the complexity of this product, if you will, it's one that there's a lot of science needed to understand our impact and the intricacies of our influence. It's not easily commodified, and thus investment has not really been at the level that we initially hoped. So part of our transition in funding has been to look for alternative funding sources, entities that are understanding of our work and its role in benefiting them or interests they care about. So the other trend is also the US federal government in recent years has really ramped up their funding for wildfire management. And we've been able to tap into some of that funding, particularly to reduce the risk of wildfire to communities, which in turn reduce the risk to forest loss and biodiversity and ultimately water supplies as well. And just to say, the wildfire essentially causes a situation where the water runs off very quickly, it's contaminated with all the burnt material, and it can clog up all the intakes. And in New Mexico, we have a lot of freshwater intakes. So essentially, we're preventing that from happening is what we're doing. Your question about 10, 20, 30 years out, this is a good question and a hard one to answer. I'm optimistic, our team is optimistic that we'll continue to find success in fundraising. So we'll grow our funding sources, both in terms of the amount of funds raised, so we can get to that scale that we need to, and also the variety of funding sources that we have. We're looking at opportunities to engage water users more through water utilities. And this could be mandatory tariffs or voluntary tariffs. We've been working with Nature for Water to really understand what those options are and starting to engage our partners at the utilities and understanding what is realistic. So long-term, more diversity in funding, and we're optimistic more funding as well.
Thank you, Jason. Unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour or our time. So we have a few questions that are unanswered. We'll have the panelists answer them, and I will share them together with the recording. So apologies for those unanswered questions. However, I'll make sure we answer them. So as we close, there is one important announcement that the Nature for Water has finally opened the year call for proposals. This opened today. Therefore, they are inviting all of you, all applicants, to apply. And if you have any questions, to join the live webinar on Thursday, the 27th. And we are posting a link on the chat how to register, or you can access it through the resources button. Thank you, Nancy, for posting that on the chat. Please visit the Nature for Water Facilities website for more information. And thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. It was lovely having you all. Have a lovely day and a lovely evening as well. Bye everyone. Thank you.